was bound within a vessel. An ancient sword they called the Sword of Power. Yeah, I know. But that's what they went with.
Your entire lives are built on the backs of men and women who have won the fight. And as your king's man-at-arms, you can bet I won a lot of fights. This is a fairing. They're a fine and diligent bunch, sire. All of them?
No dancing, Adam.
Mm-hmm.
Come on.
Bye-bye. Man, good. Look, as soon as he turns around.
Now I step into the light. So you shall look upon your downfall.
Go.
There is a sword at the center of Masters of the Universe, but the most interesting thing about it is not the power it gives Prince Adam. It is the life it refuses to let him forget. Adam has been separated from Eternia and living on Earth, and the sword of power becomes the path that pulls him back toward the home and identity he left behind. And that is where I want to open this movie. Welcome to the Film Box, where we follow the details a movie leaves behind. We pick up the object, the choice, the contradiction that seems small at first, and keep pulling until another compartment opens. Because every film is a box. We open it together. With Masters of the Universe, our first clue is that sword. On the surface, that sounds obvious. This is He-Man. Of course, the sword matters. But this version gives the object a second function. It is not simply a key that unlocks strength. It is a bridge between two versions of Adam, the man who has built a life on Earth, and the prince whose world needs him again. The weapon does not only promise transformation, it demands confrontation. That difference matters because this movie arrives carrying decades of He-Man history. The character began as part of Mattel's 1980s franchise, expanded through animation, and had already reached live action long before this 2006 adaptation. So the challenge is not merely to tell a fantasy adventure about good and evil. The challenge is to make inherited mythology feel emotionally necessary again. And for me, that is where the film becomes both interesting and frustrating. My personal rating is a 5 out of 10. That does not mean there is nothing here worth opening. There are images with real scale ideas that nearly find emotional weight, performers trying to locate human personalities inside characters built from myth, and moments where Travis Knight's film seems ready to become a sincere adventure about identity, inheritance, and the fear of returning to a place that remembers who you used to be. Knight is the director of this 2026 adaptation with Nicholas Galitzine playing Adam and Jared Leto playing Skeletor. But there is another movie fighting against that one. It wants the velocity of a modern franchise blockbuster. It wants humor, spectacle, nostalgia, world building, mythology, romance, action, and enough recognizable material to reassure longtime fans. None of those impulses is automatically a problem. The problem is what happens when they compete for the same space. Sometimes the movie reaches for the heart of Adam's story. Sometimes it races toward the next piece of iconography before the previous one has had time to matter. That is also why I do not want to judge this film only by whether the armor looks right, whether a familiar name appears, or whether the action is large enough. Those things matter, but they are surfaces. The more revealing test is whether the movie turns recognition into meaning. That tension is going to become one of our most important connections. Because watch what happens whenever the movie asks Adam to become He-Man. The physical transformation is only the loudest part of the idea. Underneath it sits a quieter question. When does accepting who you are become courage? And when does it become surrendering to what everyone else expects you to be? That is more interesting than simply asking whether the hero can defeat the villain. And it gives us a way to look at Skeletor, Taylor, Man-at-Arms, Eternia, and even the Earth material without treating them as separate boxes of franchise information. They all put pressure on Adam's identity from different directions. One represents the world he left, another represents the life he built. Some characters remember the prince, others know the ordinary man. The sword stands between those identities and refuses to let either one disappear. So as we move through this breakdown, keep that object in mind. Not because we are going to obsess over every appearance of a prop, but because it gives us a trail. When the film works, does the sword feel like power, memory, responsibility, or belonging? When the film loses its grip, does that meaning get buried beneath spectacle? And by the time we reach the ending, does Adam truly choose his identity, or does the story simply place the old title back in his hands? No spoilers yet. We will earn those answers later. For now, think about the contradiction built into this fantasy. Masters of the Universe promises a hero becoming enormously powerful, yet its most useful dramatic idea is that power alone cannot tell him who he is. A sword can unlock strength. It can point toward home. It can reconnect a man with the destiny he tried to leave behind, but it cannot make the choice for him. And that is our first clue. Because once you stop looking at the sword of power only as the thing that turns Adam into He-Man and start looking at it as the thing that forces Adam to face the life he abandoned, the movie begins to open differently. And the next compartment is where the real hook appears. And the hook is not that Adam can become He-Man. It is that this movie first asks him to live without being He-Man. That sounds like a small distinction, but it changes the entire shape of the fantasy. Adam has spent 15 years separated from Eternia before the Sword of Power draws him back toward a home now dominated by Skeletor. That basic setup is part of the film's official premise. Instead of introducing a prince who simply needs to discover his strength, the movie begins with someone who has already experienced distance from the identity waiting for him. Think about what that means. For Adam, becoming He-Man is not only gaining something, it is losing the excuse to remain somewhere else. That is much more uncomfortable. A traditional power of fantasy usually creates anticipation around the moment when an ordinary person finally becomes extraordinary. You know the rhythm. Weakness gives way to strength. Doubt gives way to confidence. The world suddenly sees what the hero was capable of all along. But Masters of the Universe quietly places another question underneath that structure. What if the extraordinary identity is exactly what the hero has been avoiding? Now the Sword of Power becomes dangerous in a completely different way, not because of what it can do to an enemy, because of what it demands from Adam. Once that sword re-enters his life, the comfortable distance between Adam and Eternia begins to collapse. The past is no longer abstract. Home is no longer somewhere far away. Responsibility stops being an idea that can be postponed, and suddenly the most powerful man in the universe can feel strangely trapped. That is the contradiction I kept returning to while watching this movie. He-Man is supposed to represent certainty. Visually, conceptually, culturally, everything about the character screams certainty. Massive strength, iconic weapon, clear heroic silhouette, a name that practically announces what he is before he even speaks. But Adam is more interesting when certainty is exactly what he does not have. Who is he when the symbol is removed? Who is he when nobody is asking him to lift a sword? And if he has created another version of himself away from Eternia, does returning home mean recovering his true identity or abandoning the person he became while he was gone? That is where this film has the opportunity to become more than a revival of familiar characters. Because nostalgia is easy recognition, drama requires consequence. You can bring back Castle Grayskull. You can bring back Skeletor. You can bring back Tila, Man-at-Arms, the armor, the mythology, the colors, the names, and all the visual language attached to this universe. Nicholas Kalipsin plays Adam and He-Man, while Camila Mendes plays Tila, Idris Elba plays Duncan or Man-at-Arms, and Jared Leto takes the role of Skeletor. But recognition alone cannot make any of those things emotionally important. The movie has to answer a harder question. Why does Adam need this world now? Not why does Eternia need him? That answer is obvious. A world under Skeletor needs a hero. The more revealing question is why Adam needs Eternia. Because if returning is only an obligation, then He-Man becomes a costume Adam is forced to wear. If returning becomes personal, then the transformation can mean something deeper. And that tension creates the film's strongest, spoiler-free promise. Every person Adam meets from his former world potentially carries a version of him that he can no longer completely recognize. They remember something. They expect something. They need something. Meanwhile, the life he has known away from Eternia has allowed another identity to form. So the battle is already happening before anyone swings a weapon. It is happening inside the name. Adam. Prince Adam, He-Man. 3 ways of describing one person, but they do not automatically mean the same thing. And I think that is why the Earth versus Eternia structure is such an important creative gamble. The official story establishes Adam as someone returning after years of separation, rather than someone who has simply remained inside the fantasy world waiting for adventure. That gives the film something valuable, contrast. Earth can make Eternia feel impossible, Eternia can make Earth feel temporary, and Adam is caught between them. Now add Skeletor. Without spoiling where the film takes that conflict, notice how perfectly the villain fits the question we have just opened. Skeletor controls through domination. His world reduces complicated choices into obedience. There is no room for Adam to remain uncertain forever because the condition of Eternia forces him toward a decision. That is the mechanism. The external world pressures the internal identity, and if the movie understands that mechanism, every action sequence can become more than spectacle. Every step toward He-Man can also become a step toward accepting something Adam would rather keep at a distance. That is the version of Masters of the Universe I wanted to see fully emerge. Sometimes it does. Sometimes you can feel the movie touching their deeper nerve, and sometimes the machinery of a huge fantasy adventure becomes so busy that the nerve disappears underneath it. That push and pull is going to matter throughout this breakdown, especially when we eventually reach my 5 out of 10 verdict. The rating is not coming from a rejection of what this movie tries to be. It comes from how often I could see the stronger version of the film sitting just beneath the version we actually get. That makes the experience more fascinating than a simple success or failure, because the movie keeps opening doors: identity, home, inheritance, expectation, power, choice, and behind almost every one of those doors is the same object waiting for us again: the sword. The thing that can make Adam powerful is also the thing that makes hiding impossible. And before we follow that clue deeper into the story, we need to understand how this enormous return to Eternia finally made it to the screen. Because the road behind Masters of the Universe may be almost as complicated as the road Adam takes home, the road back to Eternia was not straight. That matters before we talk about a single costume, creature, or effects shot, because this version of Masters of the Universe carries the weight of several abundant versions behind it. The project spent years moving through Hollywood, including periods of development at Sony and Netflix, before Amazon MGM Studios became the home that finally pushed this incarnation toward the screen. That history changes the way I read the movie's determination to put so much on screen at once. When a property survives that many false starts, the eventual film can feel as if it knows it may not get another chance. You can sense that pressure in the sheer appetite of the finished movie. It wants Earth. It wants Eternia. It wants the sword, the armor, the villains, the allies, the strange technology, the fantasy architecture, the comedy, the mythology, and the emotional origin story. That ambition is exciting, but it also helps explain one of the tensions we will keep finding. The film often behaves like a production trying to prove the entire franchise can exist in live action, not merely like one story choosing exactly what it needs. That is an important difference, because proving a universe exists encourages addition. Telling a strong story often requires subtraction. The second production fact is more creatively revealing. Travis Knight directed the film, while Chris Butler wrote the screenplay identified by Mattel when production began, building on earlier draft work by David Callahan and Eron and Adam Nee. Put those names and that development history together and you can understand why the movie keeps trying to balance sincerity with playfulness. Knight is not approaching Eternia as if embarrassment is the price of admission. The film does not spend all its time apologizing for swords, skull-faced villains, impossible machines, brightly designed warriors, or a hero called He-Man. That is important. A completely cynical version of this material would collapse almost immediately, because Masters of the Universe only works if the filmmaker is willing to believe in its ridiculous grandeur long enough for you to believe in it. But the multiple stages of screenplay development also matter when you watch the storytelling rhythm. I cannot point at a scene and tell you which writer created which beat unless reliable documentation establishes that, and pretending otherwise would be guesswork. What we can see is the final result. Some passages feel like intimate character fantasy. Others feel engineered as broad franchise entertainment. The strongest moments make those impulses cooperate. The weaker ones make you feel the seams. There is another reason this creative combination interests me. The material lives right on the border between science fiction and fairy tale. Eternia can place advanced machinery beside ancient-looking stone. Technology can exist beside magic. A warrior can carry something futuristic while another character looks as though they walked out of an old legend. The filmmaking therefore has to establish one rule very quickly. Contradiction is normal here. The world cannot stop every few minutes and explain why a laser and a sword belong in the same room. It has to behave as though they always have. That is where the tone becomes crucial. When the movie commits to that mixture, The contradictions stop feeling like mistakes and start feeling like the identity of masters of the universe. When it becomes too eager to make everything accessible through familiar modern blockbuster rhythms, some of that strangeness loses its power. For me, the better choice is almost always the one that trusts Eternia to be Eternia. And that also helps explain why the strongest design moments are not necessarily the busiest ones. Scale catches your eye. Coherence keeps you inside the world. A corridor, a piece of armor, a machine, or a throne becomes convincing when it appears to obey the same cultural logic as everything around it. The goal is not realism, the goal is consistency. Then there is Nicholas Galitzine. Amazon MGM Studios and Mattel officially announced him as He-Man in May 2024, with Knight directing and Butler writing. That casting becomes more interesting when you stop thinking only about finding somebody who can physically resemble an action figure. Because look at what the movie asks Adam to do. The role has to work before the transformation. If Adam only becomes compelling after the armor, the sword, and the heroic silhouette arrive, then the story has failed its own setup. Galitzine therefore has to sell uncertainty, displacement, and vulnerability before the visual mythology takes over. That is why I think the casting choice is most revealing in the quieter material. A production can use training, costume design, lighting, framing, music, and effects to build an icon. What it needs from the actor is the person underneath that icon. And whether every emotional beat lands or not, that priority is visible. You have to believe there is something Adam could lose by becoming He-Man. Otherwise, gaining the power costs him nothing. The fourth production detail sounds less glamorous, but it reveals the size of the machine required to manufacture this fantasy. Production took place around London in 2025, and Amazon later detailed an initiative outside London in which the film's production used 3 hydrogen power units for parts of its base camp operations, while electric vehicles were incorporated into cast transportation. That does not magically make a scene better, and an environmental production initiative should never be treated as proof of artistic quality. What it does reveal is the industrial scale hidden behind images designed to feel effortless. When Adam stands inside a world filled with elaborate environments, costumes, effects, vehicles, creatures, performers, and lighting, you are seeing the endpoint of a production ecosystem far larger than the frame suggests. That makes me appreciate the moments when the physical world has weight. The best fantasy production design makes you stop thinking about departments and start believing that people have lived in this place for generations. Here, whenever Eternia feels tactile instead of temporary, the illusion becomes much stronger. You stop seeing a franchise asset, you start seeing a civilization. And that brings us to the fifth production fact. Because a world this visually loud needs a musical identity large enough to meet it. Daniel Pemberton composed the score, and his musical approach included collaboration with Queen guitarist Brian May. Variety described Pemberton's approach as deliberately big and fun, with May's distinctive guitar contributing to that musical identity. That decision tells you almost everything about what the movie wants its soundtrack to accomplish. Subtlety is not the first objective. Elevation is. The music wants the moment when a piece of iconography enters the frame to feel larger than the object itself. It wants scene, mythology, color, momentum, and rock energy to collide. And when that approach works, it performs an important job for the film. It makes material that could easily feel self-conscious, feel emotionally committed instead. That becomes especially important for our sword glue. A prop becomes mythology partly through repetition, framing, performance, and consequence. But music can finish the transformation. The right musical choice can tell you that Adam is not simply holding metal, he is touching history, expectation, responsibility, a version of himself that existed before he was ready to face it. And now these 5 production facts begin to connect. A movie that survived years of development arrives with something to prove. A creative team chooses to embrace the strange collision of fantasy and science fiction rather than erase it. A leading actor has to establish the human being before the icon. A huge physical production has to make an impossible world feel inhabitable. And an oversized musical language has to convince you that these objects deserve to feel mythic. Put those mechanisms together, and you can see what Masters of the Universe is attempting before we even fully open the story. It is trying to turn recognizable franchise objects into emotional evidence. Sometimes that transformation works, sometimes you can still see the machinery underneath. And that distinction is going to matter enormously because now that we know how this box was built, we can finally examine what kind of movie the filmmakers actually put inside it. So what exactly is inside this box? Masters of the Universe is a 2026 live-action fantasy adventure directed by Travis Knight, bringing Mattel's long-running franchise back to feature film form. Nicholas Galitzine plays Prince Adam and He-Man. Camila Mendes is Tila. Idris Elba is Duncan, better known as Man-at-Arms. Alison Brie plays Evil Lynn, and Jared Leto takes on Skeletor. But the cast list only tells you what pieces are on the board. The more important question is what kind of movie Knight has built around them. And spoiler free, my answer is this. Masters of the Universe is an old-fashioned heroic fantasy trying to survive inside the structure of a modern franchise blockbuster. Sometimes those two identities fit together beautifully, sometimes they absolutely do not. That is why my 5 out of 10 rating feels less like indifference and more like frustration with potential. There is enough personality here that I can see the movie it wants to become. There is enough scale to understand why this universe deserved another attempt at live action. There are enough sincere moments that the whole thing never feels completely empty. But there is also enough congestion, tonal uncertainty, and familiar blockbuster machinery that the more distinctive movie frequently has to fight for oxygen. And that battle begins with the reason this film exists at all. Masters of the Universe comes from a property whose history reaches back to Mattel's famous franchise and its early 1980s cultural explosion. Amazon describes this film as a new live-action adaptation of that classic property, while Mattel positioned the production as a major return of its characters to theatrical filmmaking. That history gives the movie two jobs. The first is obvious: bring He-Man back. The second is much harder: explain why He-Man should matter now. Those are not the same assignment. Recreating something recognizable can trigger nostalgia immediately. You show the sword, you reveal Skeletor, you let familiar names enter the story. Longtime fans understand the reference before the movie has to explain anything. But nostalgia creates recognition, not investment. For a new generation, Adam has to work as a character even if He-Man means absolutely nothing to them. And that is why the film's central premise is such an important choice. The official setup places Adam away from Eternia for 15 years before the Sword of Power leads him home, where Skeletor's rule has transformed the world he left behind. That single decision turns this from a straightforward origin story into a return story. And return stories carry different emotions. An origin asks, "Who will I become?" A return asks, "Who will I become? What happened to the person I used to be?" That is a much richer question for this particular character because He-Man is already such an overwhelming symbol. If the movie began by immediately presenting Adam as the completed icon, there would be very little room between the human being and the legend. Instead, distance creates that room. Earth and Eternia become more than two locations. They become two definitions of Adam. One gives him the possibility of being ordinary. The other remembers that he never really was. So at its heart, I do not think this is simply a movie about defeating Skeletor. It is about inheritance. Not inheritance as money or property, inheritance as expectation. The identity your family remembers, the responsibility your home still associates with your name, the version of yourself waiting in a place you thought you had escaped. That is what gives the Sword of Power its function in our Blue Trail. It does not merely reveal strength, it reconnects Adam with an unfinished sentence. And that is why the fantasy works best whenever the movie allows the emotional story and the mythological story to become the same story. Adam does not need to save Eternia because superhero logic says the protagonist must defeat the villain. He needs to decide whether Eternia is still his responsibility. That distinction gives choice to something that could otherwise feel predetermined. Now, who is this movie actually for? First, obviously, long-time Masters of the Universe fans. If you have spent years wanting to see He-Man, Teela, Man-at-Arms, Skeletor, the Sword of Power, and Eternia treated with the scale of a contemporary live-action fantasy production, Different understands that appetite. Mattel and Amazon MGM clearly built this adaptation around recognizable pillars of the franchise rather than disguising its origins. But I think the more interesting audience is the person who has no emotional attachment to any of this, because then the film has to survive without nostalgia protecting it. For that person, the attraction is simpler. This is a bright, strange science fantasy adventure about a man being dragged back toward an identity he has spent years separated from. If you enjoy worlds where ancient looking weapons, futuristic technology, royal politics, impossible creatures, and straightforward heroic mythology can occupy the same frame, there is pleasure here. If you need fantasy to be cynical before you can accept it, this may be harder to enter. The movie is strongest when it believes in its own mythology. That sincerity matters, because there is something almost defiant about presenting a hero named He-Man in 2026 and refusing to treat the name itself as a joke. The film occasionally reaches for modern humor, but underneath it, there is still an attempt to make heroism feel uncomplicated enough to inspire you and complicated enough to cost Adam something. Whether it succeeds consistently is another question, and for me, it does not. 5 out of 10 means the box contains pieces I genuinely like, surrounded by choices that keep those pieces from locking together as powerfully as they should. But before we start explaining why, we need to talk about the first thing a movie gives you before analysis has time to interfere: a feeling. Because before you understand Eternia, before you measure the performances, before you notice the filmmaking mechanisms, the opening minutes make a promise. And Masters of the Universe makes a very specific one. And the first promise Masters of the Universe makes is surprisingly simple. It wants Eternia to feel worth missing. Before adult Adam has to decide whether he belongs there, Travis Knight lets you experience the world through the period when Adam was still a child. The opening establishes a younger Prince Adam inside Eternia, surrounded by recognizable pieces of this mythology, rather than hiding them for some enormous second act reveal. Reviews of the finished film specifically note the early presence of young Adam. King Randor, Duncan, Kringar, and the landscapes of Eternia. That immediately gave me something I wanted from this adaptation: color. Not merely literal color, although the movie certainly has plenty of it. Personality. The opening does not approach Eternia as a place that needs to be embarrassed about itself. It allows royal architecture, unusual creatures, futuristic machinery, swords, armor, and larger-than-life characters to share the same reality. One contemporary review described the movie's visual world as deliberately vibrant and deeply committed to the classic fantasy setting rather than pushing it toward grim realism. That choice matters because of the expectations surrounding a modern He-Man film. You can imagine the safer version immediately. Dark skies, desaturated armor, everyone whispering about destiny. Characters treating the source material with such seriousness that the sheer weirdness of Masters of the Universe gets squeezed out. Night goes in another direction. The opening atmosphere tells you that this world is allowed to be strange, and that was probably the first thing that genuinely pulled me in. Not the promise of seeing He-Man, the willingness to make Eternia feel like Eternia. Then the film makes a smarter move. Instead of presenting young Adam as a miniature version of the unstoppable hero we know he can become, it establishes inadequacy. He is not the strongest person in the room. He is not effortlessly dominating his training. One account of the opening describes young Adam as physically smaller than the other children and shows Duncan training him alongside a young Teela. Adam struggles, improvises, and ends up being embarrassed in front of people whose approval matters to him. And suddenly our sword clue gets another piece. Before power becomes Adam's identity, weakness becomes part of his memory. That is important, because if the movie introduced Adam as naturally superior at everything, then He-Man would merely amplify qualities that were already obvious. But this opening makes the eventual fantasy more emotionally useful. Strength becomes something Adam has reason to desire. Recognition becomes something he has reason to desire. The ability to finally look like the person everybody expects him to become suddenly carries emotional weight. And beneath the colorful fantasy surface, there is something painfully ordinary about that. A child wants to make his father proud. A child sees other people performing a role more naturally than he can. A child discovers that being born into expectation does not mean you automatically know how to satisfy it. That is the part of the opening I found much more interesting than the mythology itself. Duncan helps make that work. Idris Elba's character is introduced not merely as a warrior but as an authority figure connected to Adam's development. And the early material establishes him as someone capable of recognizing Adam's value when Adam himself is struggling to show it in the expected way. That gives the opening warmth. And warmth is valuable here because the movie knows it is about to take something away. The peaceful, colorful Eternia established in these early passages does not remain untouched. Skeletor's forces attack, turning the world the movie has just introduced into something threatened and unstable. That assault is the event that ultimately leads to young Adam being separated from Eternia and sent to Earth with the Sword of Power. Narratively, that is exposition. Emotionally, it works more like theft, and I think that distinction is crucial. The movie could have started with adult Adam on Earth and explained his origins later. That would have been faster. It probably would have been cleaner. But showing Eternia first means Earth becomes an absence. You have seen enough of Adam's original world to understand that something has been removed from him. That is what makes the transition useful. The film is not asking you to become curious about a mysterious fantasy planet you have never seen. It asks you to remember one, exactly like Adam does. Now, does everything in these opening minutes work equally well for me? No. The movie already begins showing the habit that will eventually become one of my larger criticisms. It is eager, very eager. It wants character establishment, mythology, nostalgia, comedy, emotional wounds, world building, action, villain setup, visual spectacle, and franchise recognition moving almost simultaneously. That creates momentum. It also creates compression. Some emotional moments arrive with the correct idea, but not quite enough room around them. The movie knows what the beat is supposed to mean, yet occasionally seems impatient to move toward the next impressive thing. That becomes a pattern, and you can detect it surprisingly early. Still, the first 10 minutes accomplish the most important job. They give Adam something worth returning to. They establish that beneath the muscles, armor, and enormous fantasy mythology, this hero begins from embarrassment rather than certainty. And that makes the opening image of weakness far more useful than an immediate demonstration of strength would have been. Because think about the expectation created by the name Masters of the Universe. Power, control, dominance, heroes who seem larger than ordinary life. Then look at the emotional doorway the movie actually chooses. A boy who is not yet enough. A home he cannot keep. A father whose approval feels difficult to reach. A mentor who sees something in him before he can fully see it himself, and eventually a sword that becomes his remaining connection to everything that disappeared. That is what hooked me. Not because the opening is flawless, not because every joke works or every emotional beat lands perfectly. It hooked me because for a few minutes I could see exactly how this adaptation could make He-Man matter beyond recognition. The mechanism was there. Make Eternia beautiful enough to become memory. Make Adam vulnerable enough for power to become temptation. Then separate the two. Once the movie does that, the sword of power is no longer just waiting to transform him. It is waiting to reopen the wound. And before we follow Adam any deeper into that journey, we need to stop looking at what the movie is telling us and start looking at how the movie makes us feel it. Because Eternia is not created by mythology alone. It is created by lenses, light, movement, color, editing, texture, and sound. And that opens our next compartment. And this is where one of the smartest decisions in Masters of the Universe becomes visible. Earth and Eternia do not simply look like different locations. They are photographed like different states of Adam's identity. Cinematographer Fabian Wagner worked with Travis Knight to build distinct visual languages for the worlds Adam moves between. Wagner has explained that the intention was to make the film colorful and energetic while still giving the imagery emotional depth, with the original comics becoming an important reference for color, framing, and composition that gives the cinematography a job beyond spectacle. Eternia has to represent memory, Earth has to represent distance, and once you understand that, the differences between them become part of our clue trail. Look first at Earth. The imagery is deliberately more restrained. Wagner used all the JDC X-Star Express anamorphic lenses for those sequences, combined with softer traditional lighting and a lower contrast approach. His stated goal was to make Earth feel grounded and slightly difficult to place in a precise contemporary moment. That is a fascinating choice because Adam is emotionally stuck there. Earth is technically his present, but visually, it sometimes feels like nowhere in particular. The older glass softens the image. The lighting does not explode with fantasy color. The world feels comfortable enough to inhabit, but not vivid enough to become destiny. And that is exactly what Adam needs from it. Earth is life with the volume turned down. Then Eternia arrives. Suddenly the film allows color to become aggressive. Pre-destruction, Eternia was designed around lushness and visual abundance, while the damaged version of the world becomes darker and increasingly deprived of color. Wagner described using controllable LED lighting extensively for Eternia, then allowing later environments to become visually starved, with some of the strongest illumination coming from characters and magical elements rather than from the world itself. That means color is doing narrative work. The film does not only tell you that something has been lost, it removes visual life from the frame. The earlier Eternia feels like a place Adam could remember more beautifully than reality. The later Eternia feels like somebody has drained that memory, and suddenly the sword of power becomes even more important. Because when Adam carries that object through environments stripped of their former vitality, the sword becomes one of the few things visually connected to the identity Eternia once had. The production design pushes the same idea. Guy Hendrix Diaz designed Eternia around a mixture of retro-futurist science fiction and exaggerated fantasy imagery, while the production physically constructed an unusually large amount of the world. A set visit documented huge practical environments, hand-built props and costumes, and an in-house production facility devoted to manufacturing bespoke Eternian objects. Producer Jason Lumenthal said roughly 80% of the film takes place on Eternia. You can feel the benefit whenever actors are allowed to occupy space, rather than merely appear in front of it. Stone has texture. Armor catches actual light. A corridor has depth behind the performer. A vehicle or weapon can be handled with weight. That physicality is crucial for a franchise born from toys, because the danger is obvious. Make everything too polished and Eternia becomes a digital showroom. Make everything too literal and it becomes cosplay. The strongest production design finds the space between those extremes. Objects are exaggerated enough to belong to masters of the universe, but textured enough that somebody could conceivably have used them before the camera arrived. The camera movement follows a similar principle. For action, Wagner's team used multiple systems including Steadicam, cranes, handheld rigs, and DJI Ronin setups rather than forcing every sequence into one visual grammar. The objective, according to Wagner, was to preserve variety while keeping enough physical impact beneath the heightened comic book imagery. You can see why that matters. He-Man cannot move like an ordinary action hero. The character's power requires scale. When the camera goes wider, his body becomes architecture inside the composition. When it drops lower, the heroic silhouette becomes larger. When movement follows him more aggressively, the film can turn strength into momentum. But the best shots know when not to move. That restraint becomes especially useful around the sword. When an object already carries this much mythology, frantic cutting can actually weaken it. Sometimes the most powerful choice is simply to let Adam occupy the frame with it. Give the image time. Let posture change. Let the weapon alter the geometry of the composition. then power feels like something entering Adam rather than an editing trick telling you to become excited. The editing becomes less consistent during the larger action material. Some battles have genuine weight because movement remains readable long enough for impact to register. Other passages cut so aggressively that scale becomes noise. Critics were divided on the film's action presentation, with some praising its visual spectacle, while others specifically criticized choppy editing and uneven visual effects. That inconsistency matters. More cuts do not automatically create more energy. Sometimes they reduce it. If you cannot clearly understand where bodies are located, what direction danger is moving, or what changed because of a blow, then physical strength becomes abstract. And He-Man should never feel abstract. His entire visual identity depends on weight. Then Daniel Pemberton's score arrives and deliberately does the opposite of restraint. Travis Knight has identified Flash Gordon as a major musical reference, while Pemberton constructed a deliberately maximalist sound that combines heroic orchestration, rock energy, bright pop theatricality, and Brian May's unmistakable guitar presence. Sometimes the score practically grabs the image by the shoulders. That can be exhausting. But conceptually, I understand it. This is a universe where understatement can become cowardice. The music tells you that the filmmakers are not ashamed of the material. A glowing sword is allowed to be a glowing sword. A heroic pose is allowed to be heroic. A villain can feel the frame like a nightmare illustration without somebody immediately puncturing the moment with irony. And when picture, production design, color, and music all align, Masters of the Universe briefly achieve something important. It stops looking like a modern movie trying to adapt an old toy franchise. It simply looks like Masters of the Universe. That is the technical achievement hiding inside the spectacle. Earth is photographed as a life Adam can survive. Eternia is photographed as a life he cannot forget. The camera gives those identities different textures. The lighting separates memory from damage. The production design gives mythology physical weight. The editing determines whether power feels tangible or chaotic. And the music makes absolutely certain that when the sword finally matters, you feel it. Now we have the mechanism. So the next question is unavoidable. What does Adam actually do once that mechanism begins pulling him home? Because now we have to follow the causal path of the story itself. And this is the point where every choice starts creating consequences. Adam's central problem is almost embarrassingly ordinary before it becomes cosmic. He wants to go home. That is the cleanest way to understand the story, and it is why the Earth material matters even when some of the comedy around it feels broader than I would prefer. 15 years after being sent away from Eternia, Adam is living under the name Adam Glenn, stuck in an ordinary job and still searching for the sword of power because he believes it is his only route back. His memories have not disappeared. If anything, they have become a burden because nobody around him can verify them. He knows who he was, but the world he lives in treats that knowledge like evidence that something is wrong with him. That gives the movie its first real obstacle. Adam does not lack information. He lacks proof. And notice how neatly that connects to the sword. As a child, the weapon represented escape. As an adult, it represents validation. If he finds it, then Eternia was real, his family was real, his childhood was real, and the identity he has been carrying alone for 15 years suddenly stops being an impossible story. So when Adam finally tracks the sword to a comic book shop on Earth, the scene is played partly for comedy, but the emotional mechanism underneath it is much stronger than the joke. He is not merely recovering a weapon. He is recovering evidence that he has not imagined his own life. The problem is that possession does not automatically restore understanding. Adam has the object, but he no longer remembers how to use it correctly. The symbol has returned before the confidence has. That is such an important choice. The movie does not reward Adam simply for finding the sword. It makes him confront the gap between remembering where he came from and actually being ready to become who that world needs. Then Eternia reaches Earth before Adam can reach Eternia. Beastman is sent after the sword, transforming Adam's private obsession into an undeniable public threat. Tila arrives and pulls Adam into the conflict, and the reunion immediately changes the emotional temperature of the story. The person who remembers Adam from before exile is standing in front of the adult he became without her. She is living proof that his past exists, but she is also proof that the past did not wait for him. That is the second obstacle. Adam wants to return to the home he remembers, but the home he remembers no longer exists. When Tila takes him back, Eternia has been devastated by Skeletor's rule. The bright kingdom associated with Adam's childhood has become damaged, frightened, and divided. The visual contrast we discussed in the previous layer now becomes story information. Adam's memory and Adam's reality collide. And this is where a weaker version of the movie might simply announce that the prince has returned and immediately hand him authority. Instead, the surviving resistance does not automatically accept him. That is exactly the right complication. A lost prince can feel legendary from a distance. A man arriving after 15 years, carrying the earth habits and talking differently from the people who stayed behind is much harder to trust. Adam thinks the sword proves who he is. The resistance has lived through years of occupation, defeat, and loss. Why should one object erase all of that suspicion? Again, the sword means one thing to Adam and something else to everyone around him. To him, it is proof. To them, it might be a weapon in the hands of a stranger. And then the movie gives Adam another piece of his past, in the least comfortable form possible. Duncan is alive, but the man at arms Adam remembers has been reshaped by failure. The warrior who once tried to teach a vulnerable child how to stand tall has spent years carrying the shame of losing when Skeletor's forces took Eternia. The mentor and the student are now distorted reflections of each other. Adam believes he failed because he lost the sword and never returned. Duncan believes he failed because he could not protect the kingdom. Neither man sees himself as the hero the other once needed. That connection is more important than the plot machinery around their reunion, because this story is quietly building toward a definition of strength that has nothing to do with being physically unbeatable. Adam eventually escapes confinement with Tila, Duncan, and Roboto, but the escape only pushes the central question forward. Skeletor's forces find them, and Adam can no longer survive by treating conflict like something he can talk around forever. One of the film's recurring jokes is that Earth has taught Adam a softer, more corporate vocabulary for handling disagreement. Sometimes the joke lands. Sometimes it feels like the script underlining the contrast too aggressively, but conceptually it has a purpose. Earth did not merely make Adam weaker, it taught him another way to think. That matters when the sword of power finally responds to him and he transforms into He-Man during the confrontation with Trapjaw. The obvious reading is that Adam has finally gained the strength required to fight back. I think the more interesting reading is that his Earth identity does not disappear when He-Man appears. That is crucial. If the transformation simply erased the awkward conflict-averse, displaced man we have been following, then the film would be saying that Adam becomes worthy only by replacing himself with a stronger personality. Instead, his first instinct remains Adam's instinct. He still tries to solve problems like Adam. The body changes faster than the worldview, and that is where the movie's central contradiction becomes visible. Adam now looks exactly like the hero Eternia has been waiting for, but internally he's still trying to understand what heroism means. The immediate victory proves that the power is real, yet it also creates a larger consequence. Skeletor now knows that Adam has returned with a sword. From that point on, the story stops being about whether Adam can find his way back into Eternia. It becomes about what he is willing to risk now that he is there. The Resistance moves through a world where Skeletor's control has consequences for everyone, not just the royal family. Adam sees that the years he spent searching on Earth were years other people spent surviving under occupation. That makes his return emotionally complicated. He is not responsible for being exiled as a child, but guilt does not always care about logic. Adam begins observing the suffering around him as if every ruined piece of Eternia is evidence that he arrived too late. Then Skeletor finds the perfect pressure point. Adam's parents are alive, or at least that is the promise used to draw him toward Snake Mountain. This is where the central want becomes dangerous. Until now, Adam has said he wants to save Eternia. But saving a kingdom is abstract. Saving your parents is not. Skeletor understands that difference. He does not need to defeat human strength if he can manipulate Adam's need to repair his childhood. And suddenly the sword is no longer proof, memory, or transformation. It becomes currency. Adam is forced to consider whether the object that may be Eternia's best chance of liberation is worth risking for the possibility of recovering the family he lost. Skeletor specifically uses the survival of Adam's parents to lure him toward a confrontation at Snake Mountain. This is the kind of choice the movie needs more of because it makes power emotionally expensive. Tila and Duncan can warn him. The resistance can understand the danger. But Adam has spent 15 years carrying one impossible image in his head, home as it was before everything went wrong. Now Skeletor offers him a path toward part of that image. Of course, Adam takes it, not because it is strategically wise, because he is still the child who watched his world disappear. That is the mechanism. Skeletor does not bait the hero, he baits the sun. Adam enters the confrontation believing he understands the trap, but knowing a trap exists does not make you immune to it. The meeting collapses into violence. Adam uses the strength of He-Man to fight his way through the threat. Yet in the chaos, his attempt to protect his father contributes to the disaster he was trying to prevent. Skeletor gets the sword, and Adam is left facing a loss that physical power cannot reverse. This is where the story finally attacks the fantasy at its center. Adam found the sword. He returned home. He became He-Man. He became strong enough to do things the child version of him could never have imagined, and he still could not control the outcome. That is the consequence the entire first half has been building toward. Power solved the surface problem. It did not solve Adam. The confrontation with Randor becomes especially important because Adam's childhood wound was never simply that his father was demanding. It was that Adam interpreted that distance as proof that he was disappointing. The boy who could not win the training duel grew into a man who believed becoming powerful might finally correct the old failure. But approval that arrives only after transformation would be emotionally empty. What matters is that Randor's final recognition is directed toward the person Adam became, not simply the body of He-Man. And that makes Adam's grief more complicated. He finally receives the thing he wanted from his father at the exact moment when he can no longer repair their relationship. Randor dies after expressing pride in Adam, while Skeletor escapes with the Sword of Power. Then Skeletor takes the sword. That reversal is essential, because for most of the movie Adam has been attaching one need after another to the same object. The sword will prove his memories are real. The sword will take him home. The sword will make the resistance believe him. The sword will give him power. The sword will allow him to protect his family. Every time Adam feels incomplete, the story gives the sword another responsibility. So once Skeletor possesses it and Adam is imprisoned, the Finn strips away the easiest answer. Radio Times likewise identifies the loss of the sword and Adam's imprisonment as the crucial reversal leading into the final movement. He cannot rely on the symbol anymore. He cannot perform certainty through the He-Man body. He cannot return to Earth and pretend none of this happened. He is simply Adam again, surrounded by people who have every reason to feel defeated. And this is the point where Duncan's role completes the connection established near the beginning. The mentor who once taught young Adam how to keep standing has also been living inside his own failure. Now each man has seen the other's weakness. Adam sees Duncan without the title of man-at-arms. Duncan sees Adam without the sword. And neither one gets to hide behind the identity that once made him look strong. That is why the next choice matters more than the first transformation. Adam has to lead before he has proof that power will return. He has to act while the object he has treated as the answer to his entire life is in somebody else's hands. He has to stop asking whether he looks like He-Man and start deciding what He-Man is supposed to mean, so the resistance begins to move again, not because Adam has suddenly become invincible, because defeat has finally removed every remaining excuse. Skeletor believes taking the sword means taking Adam's power. Adam believes it too, at least for a moment. And that shared assumption carries us directly toward the film's biggest reveal. The sword has been our clue from the beginning. We have watched Adam treat it as memory, evidence, transportation, identity, strength, and salvation. Now the movie has taken it away. Which means there is only one compartment left to open. What if the sword was never the source of the thing Adam was searching for, and this is the moment the box opens completely? For all the things Masters of the Universe struggles with, there is one achievement I do not want my 5 out of 10 rating to erase. This movie understands that He-Man has to feel enormous, not simply muscular, not simply powerful. Enormous in the way a childhood idea feels enormous when somebody finally gives it physical form. And Nicholas Galitzine is the person who has to make that work. What I like most about his performance is not actually the transformation into He-Man. It is the contrast he creates on either side of it. Adam carries himself like somebody who has spent years learning how not to occupy too much space. His Earth personality is conversational, uncertain, occasionally awkward, and far more interested in talking through conflict than dominating it. Then the sword of power changes his physical presence without instantly deleting the personality underneath. That distinction saves the performance. Because Galit Singh could easily have played Eman as a completely separate mode, deeper voice, larger poses, permanent confidence, superhero switched on. Instead, traces of Adam remain visible. That makes the strength funnier at times, but it also makes it more human. Variety's review similarly singled out Galit Singh as providing energy and personality even while criticizing the movie surrounding him. While other critical coverage identified his Adim and Idris Elba's Duncan as central to the film's emotional structure, and Idris Elba may actually be the film's most reliable emotional anchor. Duncan works because Elba does not perform him as a walking encyclopedia of Eternian mythology. He feels tired, responsible, protective. There is history in the way he responds to Adam, and that history gives their relationship more weight than pages of exposition could. Duncan once represented the kind of strength Adam lacked. Later, Adam returns and discovers that Duncan has his own failures. That reversal is strong storytelling because mentor and student stop existing on opposite sides of perfection. They become two men asking whether failure disqualifies them from being useful. A positive contemporary review also highlighted Elba's ability to give Duncan wisdom, loyalty, and emotional importance, particularly through the film's recurring fatherhood and mentorship material. Then there is Jared Leto's Skeletor. This performance is going to divide people. I understand that completely. But I think the movie would be significantly less alive if Skeletor were played safely. Leto goes enormous. The theatricality is not hidden. The villain enjoys being a villain. He occupies this universe like someone who understands that subtle naturalism is not necessarily the correct language for a skull-faced tyrant ruling a planet filled with magic swords and impossible warriors. And when the movie lets him lean into that, Skeletor gives the film something desperately valuable, flavor. It does not feel imported from a generic science fiction blockbuster. It belongs specifically to this strange box. That is why even reviews that criticize other elements of the film repeatedly identified Skeletor as one of its most entertaining presences. Structurally, the best choice is still the decision to build the story around returning rather than discovering. Adam does not begin as a blank hero entering Eternia for the first time. He has history there. That gives almost every important relationship two layers. There is what exists now, and there is what Adam remembers. Tila is not simply an ally. Duncan is not simply a mentor. Randor is not simply a king. Eternia is not simply the setting. Each one is a confrontation between memory and reality. That is far more useful than a standard chosen one structure because the film can make every reunion reveal something about the years Adam lost. And notice how efficiently that idea strengthens our sword clue. At the beginning, Adam thinks the sword is the solution because it can reconnect him with the past. But the story gradually demonstrates that returning to the past is impossible. He can return to the place. he cannot return to the moment. That is one of the movie's strongest ideas. The direction becomes strongest whenever Travis Knight expresses that idea visually instead of explaining it. Eternia is colorful, excessive, physical, and unapologetically strange. Knight and cinematographer Fabian Wagner allow castles, armor, machinery, creatures, glowing weapons, and enormous bodies to exist together without forcing the world into grim realism. Contemporary review to repeatedly praise the film's color palette, cinematography, and ambitious world building even when criticizing its CGI or narrative excess. And I think that matters more than technical perfection. There are effects I can question. There are images where the digital work does not disappear completely. But the larger design philosophy is right. Masters of the Universe should not look embarrassed. It should look like somebody opened a toy box and gave every impossible object its own mythology. The film understands that. Then Daniel Pemberton's music takes that philosophy and turns the volume all the way up. The score mixes orchestral heroism with rock energy, and Brian May's guitar becomes part of that larger musical identity. The release soundtrack credits Pemberton with May involved on material including the Eternia theme, while contemporary reviews repeatedly noted how strongly the guitar-heavy score contributes to the movie's scale. Sometimes it is too much, but when it works because it refuses to treat heroism ironically. The music does not quietly suggest that Adam might be powerful. It practically announces that mythology has just entered the room. And nowhere do all these strengths connect better than the extended Snake Mountain battle. This is my unforgettable scene, not because it contains the most enemies, not because He-Man performs the biggest physical feats, because the action finally reveals character. The sequence unleashes Adam's strength at almost frightening intensity. Galitzin described the scene as the point where Adam allows anger and vengeance to overwhelm the communication and perspective he has tried to maintain. Knight, Wagner, stunt coordinator Liang Yang, Galitzin, and stunt double Johnny James built the fight around that changing emotional state, with Galitzin performing substantial portions of the physical work himself. That is exactly why the scene works. The choreography is not saying, "Look how powerful He-Man is, we already know that." It is asking, what happens when Adam begins enjoying power for the wrong reason? Now every heavy swing tells us something. Every opponent he throws aside increases the danger inside Adam as much as the danger around him. The camera myth gives the battle momentum, but the physicality keeps it readable enough that He-Man feels massive rather than weightless. Men's Health reported that the sequence was designed around Galitzin's own larger movement style, with the actor wanting He-Man's attacks to reflect the weight of his body and the heavy sword of power rather than imitate a lighter sword-fighting style. That detail matters because it becomes storytelling. He-Man should not fight as though the sword weighs nothing. Power should have weight. And here it is. But the smartest part is that the scene does not allow strength to equal wisdom. Adam can defeat almost anything standing directly in front of him. His greater challenge is knowing when defeating something is not the same as solving it. That brings the entire movie back to the distinction we established near the beginning. Adam knows how to become He-Man before he fully understands how to be He-Man. When Masters of the Universe remembers that difference, it becomes the movie I wanted. Galitzin gives the icon a person. Elba gives the story emotional stability. Leto gives the villain theatrical personality. Knight gives Eternia scale and color instead of embarrassment. Pemberton gives the mythology a sound big enough to carry it. And the Snake Mountain sequence finally brings performance, action, camera movement, music, and character psychology into the same compartment. Those are real strengths. The frustrating part is that they make the weaknesses more visible. Because once you have seen how alive this movie can become when every element points toward the same idea, you begin noticing every moment when those elements start pulling in opposite directions. And that is the compartment we have to open next. And the first weakness is exactly what those strengths make harder to ignore. Masters of the Universe is trying to carry too much. At roughly 2 hours and 20 minutes, the film has enough running time to develop Adam, Tila, Duncan, Skeletor, Evil Len, Eternia, Earth, the resistance, the royal family, the mythology, the comedy, and the larger franchise possibilities, yet strangely, it still feels rushed. That is not really a runtime problem, it is a priority problem. The movie keeps adding compartments without deciding which ones deserve the most space. The result is a story that can feel both oversized and underdeveloped at the same time. Several critics made the same basic complaint, describing the movie as bloated or cluttered despite the amount of material it attempts to cover. Tila suffers from this most. Camila Mendes gives her confidence and presence, but the screenplay rarely allows Tila's internal life to become as important as Adam's. She has history with him. She has survived the years he was gone. She has experienced Skeletor's Eternia directly. That should create fascinating tension. Adam remembers the kingdom that disappeared. Tila had to live inside what replaced it. But the movie often treats that contrast as background information instead of letting it become a genuine conflict between them. Their relationship therefore feels less developed than the story seems to believe it is. When emotional or romantic beats arrive, I understand what the screenplay wants me to feel. I simply wish it had done more work to make those feelings inevitable, and this connects to a larger issue. Supporting characters frequently appear as fantastic pieces of Masters of the Universe iconography before they become complete dramatic personalities. That can be fun for fans. You recognize someone, you appreciate the design, you enjoy the ability or personality trait, then the movie moves on. But recognition cannot replace development forever. The film has assembled a huge toy box and sometimes seems afraid not to show you everything inside it. Skeletor exposes another problem. Jared Leto's performance is entertaining precisely because it is enormous, but the character underneath that performance is relatively simple. Skeletor dominates scenes through attitude, humor, cruelty, and visual presence, more than through a deeply developed motivation. Some criticism of the film specifically pointed to the villain's thin characterization despite the energy surrounding him. For a straightforward fantasy adventure, that is not fatal. A villain can simply be evil. The problem is that the rest of the movie keeps reaching toward deeper questions about identity, masculinity, inheritance, failure, and responsibility. Once you introduce those ideas, Skeletor becomes an opportunity. He could represent a distorted answer to Adam's question about power. He could show what happens when strength becomes identity instead of responsibility. The movie occasionally gestures in that direction, it rarely pushes far enough. Then there is the humor. This may be the most subjective weakness in the entire film. Some jokes work because they emerge naturally from the absurdity of this universe. Skeletor's theatrical personality can be genuinely funny. Adam's Earth vocabulary colliding with Eternian warrior culture can also create good contrast. But the film sometimes seems nervous about allowing sincerity to remain untouched. A serious moment lands, then a joke arrives, a piece of mythology becomes strange or bland, then somebody reminds you that they also know it is strange. That rhythm is familiar from years of modern franchise filmmaking, and multiple reviews noted the film's uneven balance between camp, self-awareness, and earnest fantasy. For me, the movie is better when it trusts the ridiculous material. Give me the glowing sword, give me Battle Cat, give me Skeletor screaming about power, give me impossible castles against impossible skies. You do not need to apologize afterward. The visual effects also fluctuate. There are sequences where practical environments, costumes, lighting, and digital extension blend beautifully. Then there are shots where the illusion becomes noticeably thinner, particularly during some effects-heavy action. Even positive reviews that enjoyed the movie acknowledged rough CGI moments, while harsher responses criticized the inconsistency more strongly. That matters because the physical production is often so impressive. When a real set gives a room texture and weight, a weaker digital element becomes easier to notice. And finally, the biggest missed opportunity is Adam himself, not the performance. The writing around him, the film discovers a genuinely interesting idea. Adam has spent years believing the Sword of Power will restore everything he lost. That is powerful. But the movie sometimes explains that idea faster than it allows Adam to experience it. Grief needs silence. Regret needs space. Returning home after 15 years should sometimes feel uncomfortable in ways that cannot be solved by another action sequence. The film keeps moving, and movement occasionally becomes the enemy of emotion. That is why my 5 out of 10 is not saying this movie has no heart. It absolutely has one. The problem is that the film keeps interrupting its own heartbeat. Too many characters, too many tonal switches, too much franchise machinery, too many emotional ideas competing for the same minutes. None of those weaknesses destroys the movie individually. Together, they stop a potentially distinctive fantasy adventure from becoming as memorable as its best moments suggest it could have been. And the clearest way to see that is to place this film beside other movies that face the same challenge. How do you take an enormous fantasy property, revive it for a modern audience, and make nostalgia feel like storytelling instead of packaging? That opens the comparison box. Put Masters of the Universe beside other modern fantasy adventures, and its identity becomes easier to see. The first comparison has to be Thor from 2011, not because Asgard and Eternia are interchangeable, but because both movies face a similar problem. How do you take a blonde, enormously powerful prince from an extravagant fantasy kingdom and make his emotional journey understandable to someone who has never cared about the mythology? Thor solves that problem through exile. Thor begins convinced that strength proves his worth. Earth removes his power and forces him to discover that heroism exists before the weapon returns. Masters of the Universe almost reverses that mechanism. Adam has already spent years on Earth. He does not need to learn that ordinary life exists. He has been living it. His problem is that ordinary life has become a hiding place. That gives Masters of the Universe an interesting advantage. Adam's conflict is potentially more mature because returning to power means returning to responsibility. But Thor handles his central transformation more cleanly. Everything in that movie is aimed toward one internal change. With Adam, the film has more ideas competing for attention. Homecoming, grief, identity, romance, nostalgia, rebellion, family, comedy, and franchise mythology are all pulling on him simultaneously. So while Masters of the Universe may have the more unusual emotional setup, Thor has the clearer dramatic spine. Now put it beside Dungeons and Dragons, Honor Among Thieves. This comparison exposes the tonal problem immediately. Both films understand that fantasy can be colorful, ridiculous, emotional, and funny at the same time. Neither needs its world to become grim before you are allowed to care about it. But Honor Among Thieves is much better at deciding when the joke stops. Its characters can mock a situation without making the entire universe feel disposable. When emotion arrives, the screenplay generally trusts that emotion long enough for it to land. That is exactly where Masters of the Universe sometimes hesitates. Its humor can be enjoyable, especially when the absurdity belongs naturally to Eternia, but it occasionally behaves as though sincerity requires protection from another joke, and that is unnecessary. If a movie containing Skeletor, Battle Cat, magical swords, and impossible castles has already convinced you to enter its world, then it has earned the right to become sincere inside that world. The third comparison is Barbie. That may sound stranger, but both movies begin with something similar. Properties associated so strongly with toys that adaptation itself becomes part of the challenge. Barbie refuses to pretend that history does not exist. Its relationship with Mattel, cultural expectations, nostalgia, gender, identity, and the idea of playing with a manufactured character all become material for the story. Masters of the Universe takes the opposite route. It mostly wants you to forget the commercial origins once Eternia begins. And I actually respect that. He-Man does not spend the movie explaining why He-Man is culturally strange. The film tries to make the mythology real on its own terms. That gives it sincerity. But Barbie demonstrates something Masters of the Universe could use more aggressively: specificity. Nearly every major creative choice in Barbie feels connected to what that particular property means. Some sections of Masters of the Universe could belong to many modern blockbusters. The movie becomes more exciting whenever it could belong only to He-Man. Then there is Flash Gordon. This may be the most revealing comparison of all. Flash Gordon understands a principle that Masters of the Universe occasionally remembers and occasionally forgets. Excess can be the style. Bright colors do not need justification. Huge performances do not need shrinking. Rock music and fantasy imagery do not need to behave realistically before they can create emotion. That older film commits so completely to its artificial universe that artificiality becomes sincerity. You either enter the frequency or you do not. Masters of the Universe is more technically sophisticated and far more interested in contemporary emotional psychology. But there are moments when I wish it possessed that same lack of fear. The best parts already do. When Skeletor fills the screen, when the score explodes, when Eternia becomes impossibly colorful, when Adam raises her Dafpara and the movie allows the image to be mythic without immediately explaining the joke. That is the version of this film with a distinct identity. So if you loved Masters of the Universe, my next recommendation would be Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. It gives you another colorful fantasy ensemble, another world comfortable mixing comedy with sincere emotion, and another adventure that understands fun does not have to mean meaningless. If your favorite element was the enormous retro fantasy personality, go further backward and try Flash Gordon. You will immediately see why maximalist music, heightened villains, bold colors, and unapologetic fantasy spectacle can become a language of their own. But if you did not connect with Masters of the Universe because it felt crowded, tonally unstable, or emotionally interrupted, watch Thor instead. Its mythology is simpler, its character arc is cleaner, and its Earth versus fantasy contrast is used with much tighter dramatic control. And if what disappointed you was that a famous toy property did not transform its cultural history into something more surprising, Barbie offers almost the opposite adaptation philosophy. That is what the comparison box reveals. Masters of the Universe is not failing because this kind of material cannot work. Other films have solved nearly every individual problem it faces. Its difficulty comes from trying to solve all of them at once. Be a sincere fantasy, be a comedy, revive a toy icon, build a franchise, tell a family story, create a modern hero, honor the past, invite newcomers. The film keeps reaching for every answer, and now we need to examine why those answers arrive in 2026 at all. Because He-Man did not return to the same cultural world that created him. The world outside the box had changed too. And Masters of the Universe did not return in a neutral year. It arrived in 2026 during a moment when Hollywood was still searching old shelves for recognizable worlds while audiences were becoming increasingly selective about which familiar brands deserved another trip to the cinema. That makes He-Man an unusually revealing test case. This was not simply another superhero character being rebooted after a short absence. The theatrical version of Masters of the Universe had been dormant for decades. The mythology remained alive through toys, animation, comics, and generations of fans, but a major live-action movie had to answer a difficult question. Was He-Man still a living cultural property, or primarily a powerful childhood memory? Mattel had strong reasons to find out. After the extraordinary success of Barbie, the company reorganized its film and television operations into Mattel Studios while continuing to develop screen projects based on brands including Masters of the Universe, Matchbox, Polly Pocket, and others. The strategy made He-Man part of a much larger attempt to turn familiar toy properties into modern entertainment franchises. That puts additional weight on Adam's shoulders. Inside the movie, he is trying to prove that an inherited entity still belongs to him. Outside the movie, the entire franchise is trying to prove almost the same thing. Does this identity still belong in the present? And the theatrical response gave an uncomfortable answer. Masters of the Universe opened in the United States on June 5, 2026, with about $29.4 million domestically. Its worldwide theatrical total eventually settled around $113.7 million, according to Box Office Mojo. For a movie whose production budget was widely reported around the $200 million range, that was a serious commercial disappointment. AP reported the weak opening in the context of a summer in which much cheaper horror films and comedies were drawing younger audiences and outperforming several expensive franchise releases. That context is important. The problem was not simply that people had stopped going to theaters. People were going. They were just not automatically choosing the biggest familiar brand. Films such as Backrooms and Obsession were attracting younger moviegoers with concepts that felt immediate to contemporary internet culture, while Masters of the Universe was selling a character whose strongest nostalgia belonged to an older generation. The opening weekend demographics make that divide even clearer. Variety reported that roughly two-thirds of the initial audience was male and nearly 40% was over 45. That does not mean younger people rejected the movie, but it does suggest that the theatrical audience initially leaned heavily toward people who already carried He-Man memories into the building. And suddenly our sword clue exists outside the story too. The film is about Adam carrying an inherited symbol into a changed world. The release itself was trying to carry an inherited symbol into a changed movie culture. Critics and audiences also opened very different compartments. As of August 2026, Rotten Tomatoes lists the film at 67% from 255 critic reviews, while its verified audience score stands considerably higher at 86% from more than 5,000 ratings. That gap makes sense to me. Many of the film's weaknesses are exactly the things critics are likely to notice immediately: the bloated structure, familiar blockbuster humor, uneven effects, overcrowded supporting cast, and the sense that a stronger emotional story is sometimes buried beneath franchise construction. But the qualities that work are extremely easy to enjoy. The color, the sincerity, the cast, the spectacle. Skeletor being allowed to behave like Skeletor, a gigantic E-Man raising the sword of power, while Daniel Pemberton's score makes absolutely no attempt to be modest. If you arrive wanting those things, the movie provides enough of them to create affection even when the structure underneath is unstable. So I understand why audiences responded more warmly than critics. Awards recognition tells a similar story, but we need to keep the timeline accurate. The film received 4 nominations at the 26 Critics' Choice Super Awards: Best Superhero Movie, Nicholas Galitzine for Best Actor in a Superhero Movie, Camila Mendes for Best Actress in a Superhero Movie, and Jared Leto for Best Villain in a Movie. It did not win those categories when the results were announced on August 6th. Superman won Best Superhero Movie, with David Corenswet taking the actor category, while the other nominated Masters of the Universe performances also missed their respective wins. And honestly, that level of recognition feels appropriate. This is not a film I would currently describe as an awards landmark, but the nominations acknowledge what even a mixed response should recognize. The movie has personality. Then something important happened after theaters. Amazon MGM moved Masters of the Universe onto Prime Video on July 22nd, only weeks after its theatrical debut. That may ultimately be where this particular version of He-Man finds its most natural life. At home, the financial pressure surrounding the theatrical opening becomes invisible. You are no longer asking whether a giant production justified a huge cinema investment. You are simply opening Prime Video and asking whether you want 2 hours of colorful fantasy adventure. That is a much easier invitation. But as of August 15, 2026, it is still too early to declare a genuine second wave rediscovery. The film has only been streaming for a few weeks. Reputation needs time. Cult status needs time. A generation that did not grow up with He-Man needs time to decide whether this version belongs to them. So does Masters of the Universe feel timeless? Not yet. It feels intensely like a 2026 movie trying to resurrect an older kind of heroic fantasy using the machinery of modern franchise cinema. And that contradiction may become the most historically interesting thing about it. Because the box office numbers suggest nostalgia alone was not powerful enough. The audience response suggests the people who actually opened the box often found more fun inside than the theatrical narrative around the movie implied. Which leaves one unanswered question. What happens when fans stop measuring the film by business reviews and nostalgia and start arguing about what its story actually means? That is where theories begin. And once a movie builds its entire identity around memory, power, and the possibility that Adam has spent 15 years carrying a truth nobody else believes, one theory becomes almost unavoidable. What if Eternia is not real? Some fans have pushed a darker interpretation of the movie in which Adam's memories of Eternia are psychologically constructed, with the fantasy functioning as a response to childhood trauma rather than an objective alternate world. Variations of that idea have appeared in fan discussions since the film's release, including interpretations that imagine Adam retreating back into fantasy rather than genuinely returning home. It is a fascinating theory. I also think the movie itself ultimately rejects it. The reason the idea feels tempting is that the Earth section deliberately makes Adam look unreliable from the perspective of everyone around him. He remembers another planet. He remembers being a prince. He believes a magical sword can take him home. From the outside, those claims sound impossible, and the film understands that. For a while, it allows you to feel the loneliness of knowing something that your entire environment considers absurd. That gives the theory emotional power. But emotional power is not the same as textual evidence. The film repeatedly presents Eternia, its characters, and its conflicts independently of Adam's subjective perspective. Other people possess histories, relationships, and motivations that do not depend on him witnessing them. The story, therefore, behaves as though Eternia is objectively real, rather than a private construction inside Adam's mind. So the everything is a delusion interpretation is interesting as metaphor. Literal theory. I do not think it survives close inspection, but metaphorically it reveals something important. Adam has lived for years in a world where his deepest memory sounds like madness. That means returning to Eternia is not merely geographical validation, it is psychological validation. He discovers that the part of himself he was encouraged to doubt was real all along. And that leads directly to the second major interpretation. Is the sword of power actually giving Adam power, or is it simply teaching him how to access something already inside him? The film intentionally complicates that distinction in its later mythology. Ending explanations of the released movie identify the crucial idea that Adam's connection to power cannot ultimately be reduced to possession of the physical sword alone. That makes the sword much more interesting than a magical battery. Think back through our crew trio. Adam treats it as evidence, then transportation, then identity, then protection, then strength. He keeps placing another piece of himself inside the object. That is why one of the strongest readings of the film is that Adam's real dependency is psychological. He needs the sword because he believes he-man exists on the other side of it. The physical transformation becomes almost like permission. Adam can be decisive because now he looks decisive. He can be powerful because now everybody can see power. He can claim his identity because the sword has provided visible evidence that the claim is legitimate. But if the symbol disappears and the person remains, what exactly has been lost? The question is where the movie's deeper idea becomes visible. Maybe becoming He-Man was never about transforming Adam into somebody else. Maybe it was about removing Adam's excuses for refusing to believe he was already capable of becoming that person. Then there is the most divisive interpretation surrounding this version of He-Man. Is Adam too soft? Some fan discussion has criticized his insecurity, reluctance to use overwhelming force, and earth-influenced attitude as evidence that the film weakens the traditional heroic image. Other reactions defend exactly those qualities, arguing that his restraint is the point. Adam understands that possessing enormous power does not require using its maximum force every time conflict appears. This debate interests me far more than arguments about whether He-Man is physically strong enough. Because physical strength is never really in doubt, the movie demonstrates that clearly. The question is what strength is for. Skeletor's answer is simple. If you possess power, domination proves it. Adam gradually develops another answer. If you possess power, choice proves it. That difference matters. Anybody can look powerful while winning. The harder test is whether you remain yourself when power gives you permission to become cruel. And once you see the movie through that lens, Adam's Earth personality stops being an obstacle the story needs to erase. It becomes something Eternia needs him to preserve. Earth taught him habits that Eternian warrior culture can interpret as weakness, communication, restraint, the instinct to avoid unnecessary escalation. The film sometimes turns those qualities into jokes, which weakens the idea slightly. But underneath the comedy is a legitimate heroic philosophy. He-Man does not become better by destroying Adam. He becomes better when Adam survives inside He-Man. There is also one major future-facing theory spreading through fan discussion that the franchise's unresolved family material could eventually lead toward Hordak and a larger She-Ra storyline. Fans have specifically speculated about Hordak becoming a major antagonist, but that part remains speculation. What is actually confirmed is narrower. Travis Knight has said that She-Ra would have a major role if a sequel happens. That distinction matters. A tease is evidence. A fan prediction is not confirmation. And right now, predicting exactly how that mythology would unfold means moving beyond what this film actually establishes. So which theories survive? Eternia as editorial delusion? Interesting, but contradicted by the movie's objective storytelling. The sword as a symbol or conduit rather than the complete source of Adam's identity? Strongly supported. Adam's reluctance to dominate as deliberate moral strength rather than simple weakness? I think the film supports that reading far more than its critics sometimes acknowledge. Future Hordak involvement? Possible, not confirmed. And put those interpretations together and something unexpected happens. The strongest theory is not really about Eternia, it is about Adam. The entire movie keeps asking whether identity comes from the object you carry, the title you inherit, the strength other people can see, or the choices you make when none of those things can answer for you. That question opens the deepest compartment of the film. And beneath everything else, I think Masters of the Universe is really about one fear. What if the person everyone expects you to become is not the person you actually are? That fear exists inside Adam long before He-Man appears. He was born a prince. He comes from a world filled with warriors. There is a family name behind him, a kingdom around him, and eventually a legendary identity waiting in front of him. From the outside, that sounds like privilege. From inside Adam, it feels more like pressure. Because inheritance gives you a destination before you have decided whether you want to travel there. That is why sending Adam to Earth for 15 years is more than a plot device. The official premise explicitly builds the story around that long separation before the Sword of Power leads him back to a damaged Eternia. Earth gives Adam something Eternia never really could. Anonymity. Nobody cares that he's a prince because nobody believes he's one. Nobody looks at him and sees the future He-Man. Nobody measures him against a legendary destiny. That sounds freeing. But freedom without belonging can become another kind of prison. Adam can hide from expectation on Earth, yet he cannot stop remembering the place where those expectations began. That is why home becomes such a complicated symbol in this movie. Most stories treat home as comfort. Here, home is both comfort and judgment. Adam misses Eternia because it contains everything he lost. But returning means facing everything he failed to become. That is deeply human. You do not need to have escaped from a magical kingdom to understand it. Maybe you left a family expecting something from you. Maybe you moved away from a version of yourself you no longer liked. Maybe years passed, you changed, they changed, and then you returned to discover that the old version of you was still waiting in somebody else's memory. Which person is real? The person you were, the person you became, or the person you are expected to become next? Masters of the Universe gives Adam 3 names for that problem. Adam, Prince Adam, He-Man, and the deeper story is not about choosing one and destroying the others. It is about integrating them. That is where the Sword of Power becomes the film's clearest symbol. Adam initially treats the sword almost like an external answer to an internal problem. The film establishes it as his connection back to Eternia and to his transformation into He-Man. But look at everything Adam psychologically asks that object to do. Prove that his memories are real. Take him home. Restore his position. Make people recognize him. Make him strong. Give him certainty. Tell him who he is. That is far too much responsibility for any object. And people do this constantly. Not with magical swords, with jobs, money, relationships, titles, bodies, achievements. We convince ourselves that once we obtain the thing, uncertainty will disappear. Once I get there, I will feel complete. Once people see me differently, I will finally see myself differently. Once I become powerful enough, nobody will be able to make me feel small again. Then you get the thing, and you are still you. That is the mechanism underneath Adam's transformation. Physical power can amplify him, it cannot finish him. That also explains why the movie's treatment of masculinity has generated disagreement. Some critics saw the film as deliberately wrestling with an older image of muscular male heroism, while others felt that exploration remained too shallow or tonally uncertain. For me, the more useful reading is simpler. The movie asks whether strength means having the ability to overpower somebody or having enough control not to make domination your first answer. Skeletor represents the easiest definition of power. Power means nobody can tell you no. Power means fear becomes respect. Power means control. Adam has to discover something harder. Power without restraint is not confidence, it is dependency. If you constantly need to prove that you are the strongest person in the room, then the room still controls you. That is why Adam's softer earth habits matter even when the movie sometimes turns them into jokes. The instinct to communicate is not the opposite of He-Man. Empathy is not something Adam has to discard before becoming heroic. Those qualities are what stop He-Man from becoming another Skeletor, and Duncan's place in the story extends the same idea to our failure. The mentor figure is valuable not because he represents perfect masculine certainty, but because he demonstrates that usefulness can survive defeat. That is something Adam desperately needs to learn. Failure feels permanent when you build your entire identity around performance. If I failed as a warrior, I am no longer a warrior. If I disappointed my father, I am a disappointing son. If I could not save everyone, I am not a hero. The movie pushes against that logic. A failure is something you did. It does not have to become everything you are. And suddenly the recurring pattern becomes clear. Adam keeps confusing identity with evidence. The sword is evidence. The muscles are evidence. The title is evidence. Other people's approval is evidence, but none of them can permanently answer the question. Only choices can do that. That, more than anything, is what I think this version of He-Man is trying to say. You do not become yourself once. You keep becoming yourself every time life gives you enough power to choose differently. That makes the return to Eternia more meaningful. Adam believes he is returning to recover what he lost, but you cannot truly recover childhood. You cannot rebuild the exact family you remember. You cannot walk back into a home 15 years later and discover that time politely stopped while you were gone. Returning, therefore, has to become something else. Not restoration, acceptance. Adam has to mourn the world that existed and then decide whether the damaged world in front of him is still worth loving. And maybe that is the most human idea inside this extremely artificial fantasy. Home is not valuable because it stays unchanged. Home becomes meaningful when you choose to care about it after discovering that it did change. The same is true of identity. Adam cannot remain the frightened boy. He cannot remain the anonymous man on earth. And he cannot simply disappear inside the muscular image of He-Man. He has to carry all three forward. That is why our sword clue has been changing meaning throughout the entire film. At first, the sword seems to answer the question. By this point, it represents the question itself. If the sword disappeared, would Adam still know who he was? If the title disappeared, would he still act like a hero? If nobody recognized him, would his choices still matter? And once you start asking those questions, He-Man becomes much more interesting than the strongest man in the universe. Strength becomes the easiest part of him. Knowing what to do with it becomes the real test. And that brings us to one final question before we open the spoiler compartment. If this 2026 film is trying to redefine what He-Man means for a new generation, what does it actually add to the legacy of a character who has already existed for more than 4 decades? And this is the strange thing about discussing the legacy of Masters of the Universe in August 2026. The movie is barely old enough to have one. It opened only in June. So pretending we already know how film history will remember, it would be exactly the kind of certainty this box does not deserve. What we can identify is the legacy it has already started constructing, and the first achievement is straightforward. For nearly 40 years, the 1987 Masters of the Universe movie was the only major live-action theatrical version of He-Man. That film famously moved much of its adventure away from Eternia and worked under production limitations that prevented it from realizing many familiar elements of the property. The 2026 film finally gives the franchise a live-action adaptation with a production scale to put Eternia, He-Man, Skeletor, Battle Cat, Castle Grayskull, and a much broader piece of the mythology on screen together. That alone changes the franchise. Not cinema, the franchise. There is an important difference. I cannot honestly point to another movie released after June 2026 and claim that Masters of the Universe influenced it. There has not been enough time. No reliable evidence currently supports the idea that filmmakers are already copying its cinematography, its action design, its structure, or its approach to toy adaptations. So if we are asking whether this film has transformed the fantasy genre, no, not yet. And based on its commercial performance, perhaps it never will. The movie finished with roughly $64.8 million domestically and about $113.8 million worldwide, against a reported production budget commonly estimated between $170 million and $200 million. That makes its theatrical legacy complicated immediately. Because a movie built as an enormous revival did not generate the box office momentum normally associated with the beginning of a secure theatrical franchise. But financial disappointment does not erase what the production proved creatively. This mythology can survive live action without removing the things that make it strange. That may sound obvious now that we have spent this entire breakdown walking to Eternia. It was not obvious beforehand. A modern studio version could easily have reduced the colors, simplified the costumes, hidden the stranger characters, minimized the fantasy language, or transformed He-Man into something closer to a generic superhero. Instead, Travis Knight's production repeatedly chose physical scale and heightened design. The filmmakers built substantial sets, costumes, props, and environments rather than treating Eternia exclusively as a digital backdrop. That gives future Masters of the Universe adaptations a new reference point. You do not have to make He-Man less like He-Man to make him cinematic. That might become this film's most useful contribution to the franchise, not a new filmmaking movement. Permission. Permission to let Eternia be colorful. Permission to let the costumes be exaggerated. Permission to allow a skull-faced villain to be theatrical. Permission to make the Sword of Power feel mythic without redesigning the mythology until recognition disappears. And there is one more potential legacy already sitting inside the ending. She-Ra. The film deliberately plants Adora into its future-facing material, and Travis Knight has confirmed that if a sequel happens, She-Ra would play a major role. He has also made clear that those plans remain conditional rather than confirmation that another film is definitely moving forward. That matters because the 2026 film could eventually be remembered less as a standalone He-Man revival and more as the attempted doorway into a larger live-action Eternian mythology. But right now that door is only open a crack. The box office makes the future uncertain, so we should not pretend a sequel is guaranteed. And that uncertainty produces an oddly fitting connection to Adam himself. The movie is about inheriting an identity whose future is not guaranteed. The franchise now finds itself in exactly that position. He-Man has returned. The sword has been raised. The world exists. But existence does not automatically produce continuation. The people behind the property still have to prove that this version means enough to enough people to keep going. That is why the audience response may matter more over time than the immediate theatrical disappointment. Nicholas Galitzine came to the role without having grown up in the original 1980s wave, while Idris Elba approached the franchise as someone with childhood familiarity. That combination mirrors what the movie itself is trying to achieve. Connect people carrying decades of nostalgia with people meeting this version of the mythology through a newer generation of performers. Even Dolph Lundgren, the 1987 He-Man, participated in the new film and publicly described the experience in terms of passing the role forward to Galitzine. That image may be more meaningful than any box office statistic when we talk about franchise legacy. One He-Man handing the sword to another, not erasing the earlier version, not pretending the past did not happen, passing it forward, which is exactly what the film has been asking Adam to understand. Inheritance is not preservation. You cannot freeze something and call that life. You receive it, you change it, then somebody else eventually receives what you changed. So where will the reputation of Masters of the Universe go? As of August 15, 2026, we simply do not know. It could remain a costly revival, remembered for failing to turn nostalgia into enough theatrical demand. It could develop a warmer second life as people discover it away from the pressure of its theatrical expectations. Or it could eventually become the imperfect first chapter of a larger He-Man and She-Ra story. Those outcomes have not been decided yet. But the film has already accomplished one thing the franchise had been trying to accomplish for decades. It brought He-Man back to live-action cinema at full scale, and even though I only give the result 5 out of 10, I would rather see this franchise fail while looking unmistakably like itself than succeed by sending away everything strange enough to make it worth remembering. That is the legacy available right now. Not influence, not immortality. A second chance, and now there is only one compartment left before the verdict. Because we have followed the sword from childhood memory through Earth, through transformation, through loss, identity, and inheritance. Now we can finally spoil everything. And once we do, we can answer the question the entire plot trail has been building toward. When Adam loses the symbol that made him He-Man, what is actually left? Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now, go watch it, and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. The ending finally answers the question we have been carrying since the first compartment. What is left when Adam loses the sword? The answer begins with the mistake at Snake Mountain. Skeletor knows Adam well enough to understand that threatening Eternia is not the most effective way to control him. He offers something more personal, Adam's parents. Adam goes into that confrontation knowing it is probably a trap. Yet knowledge does not protect him from hope. And during the fight, that hope becomes tragedy. Adam's attempt to attack Skeletor contributes to the collapse that fatally wounds Randor. The important part is not the mechanics of the accident. It is what the moment does to Adam's understanding of strength. He finally possesses the body he once imagined would make him capable of protecting everyone, and still he cannot stop loss. Randor dies only after telling his son that he is proud of the man he became. That is brutal precisely because Adam receives the approval he wanted when it is too late to build a life around it. The film has been quietly preparing this reversal from the opening. Young Adam believes strength might earn his father's recognition. Adult Adam becomes He-Man. Then the story demonstrates that being He-Man cannot restore childhood. That is our first major reveal. Power cannot give Adam the past back. Skeletor then takes the Sword of Power, and here the film exposes an important distinction between the villain and the hero. Skeletor assumes the sword itself contains what makes He-Man extraordinary. So did Adam. That is why Skeletor's inability to simply activate its power matters. Evelyn has to pursue another route through a ritual at Castle Grayskull because possession alone does not give Skeletor what he thinks he has stolen. The villain has misunderstood the object in exactly the same way Adam has. Both men believe power can be possessed externally. Skeletor wants to seize it. Adam has spent most of the movie depending on it. The difference is what happens once that belief collapses. Adam, imprisoned with the surviving heroes and reunited with Marlena, initially falls into guilt. He sees Randor's death, Skeletor's victory, and the suffering of Eternia as evidence that he has failed again. Then Duncan performs the role he has been performing since Adam was a child. He helps him stand, not physically, internally. And this time Adam does not need his father to turn around and see him. That early childhood image becomes one of the film's quietest pieces of foreshadowing. Adam spent years measuring himself through somebody else's recognition. By the final act, he has to move before anyone can guarantee that he is enough. So he leads without the certainty of He-Man. The resistance rises with him. Duncan returns to the warrior he thought failure had erased. Roboto returns to battle alongside him. Tila moves toward Castle Grayskull with Adam, and the story deliberately strips away the easy idea that only one impossibly strong man can save Eternia. Adam matters because he inspires movement. Then we reach Castle Grayskull. Tila takes on Evelyn while Adam confronts Skeletor, and the villain finally attacks the weakest part of Adam rather than the strongest, his mind. Skeletor breaks the Sword of Power and leaves Adam critically wounded with one of its shattered pieces. Adam slips into a vision connected to his Earth life, and the sorceress appears with the truth that reorganizes everything we have watched. The power was never simply inside the sword. It was inside Adam. That realization allows him to return, restore the sword, and become He-Man again. And now go all the way back to our first clue. Adam spent 15 years searching for an object because he believed it was his road home. He found it and believed it proved his identity. He transformed with it and believed it made him powerful. He lost it and believed he had lost He-Man. Skeletor destroys it because he believes destroying the symbol destroys the man. But that is the final mechanism. The sword was never meaningless. It was simply never sufficient. It focuses power. It carries history. It connects Adam to Grayskull. It gives his identity a visible form. But the object cannot create the qualities that make the power worth having, and that changes the final confrontation. Adam gives Skeletor one last opportunity to stop. This more beat matters more to me than another display of strength. Adam has reached the point where he unquestionably can overpower his enemy. He still tries not to let power make the decision for him. Skeletor rejects that possibility. He embraces exactly what he is. So Adam finally stops treating restraint as hesitation and uses his full strength. He destroys Skeletor's stuff, and the released energy apparently destroys Skeletor himself. This is where the thematic difference becomes complete. Skeletor thinks power means control over everybody else. Adam learns that power begins with control over himself. That is why He-Man wins. Not because Adam finally becomes angry enough, because he finally stops needing strength to tell him who he is. 6 months later, Eternos has recovered much of its life. Marlena is on the throne. Duncan has returned as man-at-arms. Roboto has been repaired, and Adam even brings Hussein to Eternia, finally giving his Earth friend undeniable proof that all those impossible stories were true. I like that detail. For most of his earthly life, Adam desperately wanted somebody to believe him. At the end, he no longer needs belief to define reality. He simply shares reality with the person who stayed beside him. Then a distress signal arrives. Adam climbs onto Cringer, now armored as Battle Cat, and rides out as Eternia's protector. That is the completed transformation. Not Prince Adam becoming He-Man once. Adam choosing to remain He-Man after he finally understands that the title cannot complete him. And then the movie opens 2 doors instead of closing everything. The first belongs to the missing member of Adam's family. Marina and Duncan look over the restored kingdom and acknowledge the daughter who still has not come home. The film then reveals the blonde warrior Adora, Adam's long-lost twin sister, and the woman destined to become She-Ra. Travis Knight has confirmed that if another film happens, She-Ra would have a major role, while carefully stopping short of claiming a sequel is guaranteed. That is also changes how we understand Marlena. Adam was not the only absence she carried. The restored kingdom still contains an empty space. And if this story continues, Adam may eventually find himself on the opposite side of his own experience, trying to reconnect another lost child with a family and identity she may not recognize as hers. Then evil Lynn finds what remains of Skeletor. She retrieves his skull. The familiar laugh tells us that whatever happened inside Castle Grayskull, the villain's story is not necessarily finished. Now it has been similarly explicit that we have not seen the last of Skeletor, although exactly how he might return remains unresolved. And I actually like that final joke of resurrection because it does not undo Adam's victory. Adam did not win because Skeletor could never return. He won because when everything external was removed, father, kingdom, certainty, sword, transformation, Adam finally discovered something Skeletor never understood. Power you can steal is temporary. Identity you have chosen is harder to take. That is my strongest reaction to this ending. I wish the entire movie had been as focused as this idea. Because beneath the overcrowded mythology, uneven humor, franchise setup, and spectacle is a genuinely clean emotional conclusion. The boy wanted his father to see him. The man wanted the sword to prove him. The hero finally stops requiring either. The sword of power is our clue. But Adam was the answer. So after opening every compartment, following the sword of power from childhood memory to identity, from identity to responsibility, and finally from responsibility to choice. Where does Masters of the Universe land for me? 5 out of 10. Right in the middle. And that rating is frustrating, precisely because there is a version of this movie I can see myself loving. Nicholas Galitzine gives Adam enough vulnerability that He-Man becomes more than a body and a costume. Idris Elba gives Duncan genuine emotional weight. Jared Leto understands that Skeletor should be allowed to fill the screen rather than shrink himself into realism. Eternia is colorful, strange, physical, and frequently beautiful. Daniel Pemberton's music understands exactly how enormous this mythology wants to feel. Most importantly, the movie finds a real idea underneath all of that spectacle. The sword of power does not create Adam, it reveals what Adam has been waiting for permission to believe about himself. That is good material. The problem is that the movie does not trust that material consistently enough. It keeps adding more characters, more jokes, more mythology, more franchise setup, more spectacle, more tonal shifts. And every addition takes another small piece of attention away from the emotional story that should have been controlling everything. I wanted more time with Adam and Tila. I wanted Skeletor's relationship with power to become a sharper reflection of Adam's. I wanted the movie to allow grief to remain quiet for longer. I wanted some emotional moments to end before a joke arrived to protect them. And I wanted the final revelation about Adam's power to feel less like the discovery of an idea and more like the inevitable conclusion of an idea the entire movie had been patiently building. So who should watch this? If you already love He-Man, there is absolutely enough here to justify opening the box. You finally get a modern live-action Eternia that is willing to look like Eternia. You get the Sword of Power treated like mythology. You get Battle Cat, Skeletor, Man-at-Arms, Tila, Castle Grayskull, and a world that refuses to sand away all of its strange edges just to become another generic fantasy setting. If colorful heroic fantasy is your thing, you may also enjoy this much more than my rating suggests. This movie is not cynical about heroism. That matters. It still believes there is something exciting about watching a person stand taller, accept responsibility, and choose to protect people when walking away would be easier. But if you need tightly controlled pacing, deeply developed supporting characters, restrained humor, or a story where every narrative thread receives the space it deserves, this may become exhausting. You will probably see the same stronger movie hiding underneath it that I did, and that can be more frustrating than watching something with no ambition at all. Would I tell you to pay premium cinema prices specifically for it now? No. The spectacle can certainly benefit from a large screen and loud sound, but at this point I think streaming is the better home for the experience. Watch it when you want a huge, colorful fantasy adventure without demanding that every piece fit perfectly. Would I own it? Only if Masters of the Universe already means something personal to you, or if this particular production design, score, and cast becomes something you know you will revisit. For everyone else, one solid streaming watch is enough. And yet, I do want another movie. That may sound strange after a 5, but the pieces are here. The filmmakers have built Eternia. The cast understands the tone. Adam has finally become the version of He-Man the story spent so long searching for. She-Ra is waiting somewhere beyond the edge of the box. As Skeletor may not be finished, a sequel would not need to spend another entire movie proving that this universe can exist. It could simply tell the story. Maybe that is where this version finally becomes what it is capable of being. Because Masters of the Universe is not a disaster. It is something almost more frustrating. It is a decent movie containing flashes of a great one, and in the end Adam learns the lesson the movie itself could probably use. Having enormous power is not enough. You have to know exactly where to put it. 5 out of 10 from me. The sword may be the symbol everyone remembers. But the strongest thing this movie discovers is the man standing behind it. Every film is a box. And we opened this one together, and with that we can finally close Eternia's box. Thank you for staying with me all the way through this breakdown. If you enjoyed opening Masters of the Universe layer by layer, hit like, subscribe to the Film Box, and come back for more deep movie breakdowns, hidden details, ending explanations, and honest reviews. And I really want to hear where you landed on this one. Do you think Adam's softer, more restrained personality made this version of He-Man more interesting? Or did the movie move too far away from what you believe He-Man should represent? That is the debate I think says far more about this adaptation than arguing over costumes or visual effects. Drop your rating in the comments too. Was this a 5 like mine? Higher? Lower? And if another movie happens, would you rather see the story focus heavily on She-Ra, bring Skeletor back immediately, or explore another part of Eternia first? Because whatever happens next, this film has already done something important. It put the Sword of Power back in live-action hands. Now the question is whether this version of the universe gets enough time to discover what it can really become. Until then, keep looking past the surface. Keep questioning the obvious answer. And whenever a movie hands you a symbol that seems to explain everything, look at the person holding it. There is usually another compartment underneath. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the Fin box. See you in the next one.